name is Clinton Gardiner. I am an elder in the Narragansett Indian tribe. I was born in 1956. I was born in Wesley, Rhode Island, which is not far from Charleston, which is, I guess you would call that the base of the Narragansett Indian tribe in Rhode Island. And so, we would participate in the powwow on a regular basis. We would go to places like the Watchog Pond. I have a picture somewhere of, me with my two sisters and my mother and father sitting on the ground at Watchog Pond, which is kind of where we would go in the summertime. We'd go to the powwow and we'd see the dances, and we would see the medicine man, do the peace pipe and light the fires, and they would do the various dances. And I was a young boy then. I moved away from. My family wasn't one that participated in a lot of the powwow events in terms of, let's say, dressing up in regalia and dancing and things like that, or engaged in the crafts work of the native cultures. So growing up, I basically grew up as a regular kid, not necessarily as part of the Narragansett culture. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, when most people look at me and they consider me to be African American, you never really know what somebody is, from a bloodline or from a nationality standpoint, unless you understand their family history. You can go into the genealogical records and you can start to see how people at one point are listed as native Indian, and then they're listed as mulatto, and then they're listed as black. So you can see, how one person moves from being Indian to becoming black over the course of 40 or 50 years. And it's a fair point. I grew up in many ways as an African American. I think most of the institutions that I became associated with considered me to be an African American. But, I always knew, from an early age, because of what my family and in particular my father would say about our relationship to the tribe. I always knew we had the Narragansett Indian tribe lineage in our background. Well, my heritage comes through my father's side. His name was Lloyd Gardiner. And he gets it a couple of different ways. He gets it most recently from the Ammons line, and that would be Gideon Ammons, who had a daughter named Ella Ammons. Ella Ammons married Avaldo Gardiner, and Ella Ammons and Avaldo Gardiner had several children, one of which was Ralph Gardiner, my grandfather and my father's father, obviously. So I get to the Narragansett Indian tribe through that lineage. Gideon Ammons is also the son of George Ammons, his father, and Jerusha Noka. And so we do have a connection to the Noka family. And then Valdo Gardiner, my grandfather's father, he also is the product of a marriage between Benjamin Gardiner and Hannah Secutor. Hannah Secutor was the daughter of Aaron Secutor, who was the son of a long line of Secutors. I also get there, by the way, through my father's mother, who was a Johnson. Her mother was a Wilcox, Abby Wilcox. Back in 1998, my father died. And, when we were getting ready to, help him pass into the next world, my sisters and I wanted to acknowledge that he always felt very strongly about his connection to George Ammons. And he used to say, we were related to the chief sachem of the Narragansett Indians, and we didn't really know a lot about that. And but it turned out, so we looked into it, and I started to do a little research, and it turned out that what he said had some truth behind it. And so once I started to discover one thing, I kept looking and I discovered more and more and more and more. I found out that there was actually quite a bit of documentation out there. If you knew how to go look for it, knew where to find it. Even though the Narragansetts may not themselves have documented their history, others have, both genealogically and otherwise. You could actually get a pretty good picture of what was going on with the tribe, and the impressions that different people had about some of the events that had a strong impact on. There were certain events like, for example, the detribalization events, the Great Swamp Fight. We learned that the Narragansett Indian tribe was a very instrumental part of the growth and development of Rhode Island. So it was important for me to understand that, the blood that runs through my veins is some of the blood that walked on this land from the early times. It's where I learned a lot more about, Gideon Ammons, for example. And just very quickly, for example, go back into the history, you'll see that Gideon Ammons was really one of the prominent leaders of the Narragansett tribe in the 1800s. After he died in 1899, George Ammons did become one of the leaders of the tribe. And then after he died, any connection to the leadership of the tribe in our family dissipated, and others started to take more of a leading role. I think initially the most surprising thing I found was the whaling experience of both Gideon and Joseph. Joseph actually was, kept journals of his voyages. Gideon Ammons traveled the world as a whaler. In 1832, he and his brother Joseph got their seaman certificate, which allowed them to ride the seas and not be captured. But they were on these whaling boats, and they traveled around the world. Sometimes on voyages that would last 2 or 3 years in the early, we're going to say the 1840 to 1850 time period. So for 10 years, the two of them were at sea quite a bit. Eventually, Gideon came back and then started taking up leadership roles in the tribe, and he, was one of those members for a long time, for 50 years practically. As I learned more and more about the tribe, I became more interested in what it means to be a Narragansett. And, for me, it's more of a family ties, a heritage kind of thing. But I do recognize my heritage.